So good afternoon, everyone. My job is to speak as little as possible and give you a chance to hear these great authors and to talk about power in the new millennium. My first thought about this when Sue Ellen Lazarus asked me to do this was about going to the NBA All-Star game a few years ago, and Commissioner David Stern's wife always hosts an intellectual moment at the All-Star game, and Fareed Zakaria was a speaker there, and he said in the midst of a conversation about power, somebody asked him, what's happening with the rest of the world? Why aren't they following the United States anymore? And this was about 2009 in terms of our leadership in all these different areas. And he said, well, I think everyone woke up and realized that the teacher is a dummy. And he went from there. So as I read the books by our authors, I thought about that, and I'm curious to hear a lot about what they have to say about not just U.S. leadership in the world or power in the world, but in other institutions as well. And the books kind of cover the gamut of power, leadership, and the evolution of power. And we'll look at where we're going and where we've been. So we're just going to go down the line and hear from our three author scholars. Neil Ferguson is a Lawrence A. Tisch Professor of History at Harvard University, and his book is The Great Degeneration that we'll be talking about today. Next to him is Moises Naim, who's a scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he's also a syndicated columnist. He was also a member of the government in Venezuela at one point, so certainly an evolution of power there, and his book is called The End of Power. And then to show broad diversity, we have Sean Wilentz, who's a historian, who's written books and commentary on music, politics, and the arts. His book is 360 Sound, and we're all anxious to hear the connection of all this economic and governmental power along with the music industry. So we're just going to go down and let each of the panelists speak for 5 minutes first. I'm going to ask some questions for about 15 minutes, then as quickly as possible give you the opportunity to ask questions as well. So Neil, why don't you start us off with 5 minutes of where your book takes us.
Thanks very much, Ken. It's a great pleasure to be here. Actually, that's a lie. It's not a pleasure to be here. I'm supposed to be on vacation here. And I don't know what I'm doing on a panel. The most dangerous thing you can do as an author or public intellectual is to agree to do something like this when you are relaxed. Because that is when you are sure to say something really stupid that someone will tweet, and you will spend the rest of your vacation issuing apologies.
We're going to help you out with that, too.
Yeah, right. That's all I have to say. So Tolstoy had a great question at the end of War and Peace, and as I spend a lot of time exhorting my teenage children to read War and Peace, I'll start with Tolstoy's question. What is the power that moves nations? What do we mean by power? And let me then add a couple of questions of my own designed to get this discussion going. Is power shifting away from the West, and specifically from the United States? And if so, to whom? To China? Or to some non-state actors? And secondly, is in relative terms the position of the United States worse or better than it was, let's say, 50 years ago? This is a Kennedy-ish kind of place. So let's think back to 1963. I'm going to go through in my brief time the different dimensions of power. I won't have time to say anything like enough about any of them, but I think it helps for our discussion to make it clear that power comes in a whole variety of different dimensions. The obvious form of power that Tolstoy probably would first have thought of is military power. And in military terms, the United States is still in a league of its own, as it has been since the end of the Cold War, indeed probably was during much of the Cold War anyway. Is there anything going to change that? Two things, perhaps. One, the kind of fiscal squeeze that is coming about because of the crisis of public finance I write about in my book, The Great Degeneration. That's the first plug. It's also constrained, looking ahead, by two other deficits, which I wrote about in a book called Colossus. The manpower deficit, the fact that Americans don't particularly want to go to other places to impose their will, And the attention deficit. The United States is in a much more isolationist mood today than most people, in fact, acknowledge, and that's right across the political spectrum. The other big constraint that I think will become more important is that the gap in cyberspace is narrowing much more rapidly than the gap on the surface of the sea. And in cyberspace, the arms race is on, and China is doing very well. That is not the only form of power. There's also diplomatic power, the power that you wield when you're not firing your guns, the power that you wield through coalitions and alliances, the power that you can exercise through international institutions. Now, in that dimension of power, I think the United States, again, is ahead. But I don't think we should overlook ways in which the United States is slipping. In the Middle East and North Africa, I think we are, in fact, witnessing a major crisis of American power, though nobody in Washington appears entirely aware of that. The end of an order which the United States dominated. If that's your phone and it's for me, I'm busy. China, by contrast, is getting better at this. It was dreadful diplomatically for a while. It is improving. Really, I am very busy. If they could call back later, that would be great. And this is my cue to say what someone ought to have said already. Turn them off.
Please,
because there's a finite number of jokes I can make about mobile phones during any given talk. What about demographic power? Here, China obviously has the advantage, but the real story about demographics is the countries that are already in crisis are suffering from shrinking populations and aging populations far more than the United States or even China, Japan, and the key European country, Germany. If you're talking about demographic power, there are real problems there. But of course, those are two major American allies I just mentioned. And that is where demographics relates to diplomacy. In economic power, which is the next dimension I'll talk about, the United States is about to be overtaken by China in at least one measure of gross domestic product. According to the IMF's forecasts, China's will be the largest economy in the world on a purchasing power parity basis by 2017, which is really soon, so I'm not talking futurology here. In technological innovation, the United States still leads, but China is catching up in terms of international patents, intellectual property rights. It's amazing how fast China is catching up. What about natural resources? That's another source of power. Everybody's very excited about shale gas and tight oil, and it's true that that makes a major change in terms of US energy independence. But it doesn't fundamentally alter the fact that the Middle East remains the principal source of fossil fuel for the foreseeable future. And in that sense, there's a really important link between what I said a moment ago about the US losing control of the Middle East and China's increasing need to control the Middle East. That could be of major consequence in the years ahead. I think I just about have time to say something about soft power, but that will act as a segue to my colleagues on the other side of the table. I do not have time to talk about power as it is wielded by non-state actors, whether corporations, individuals who are really good at hacking, or networks of individuals, but I'll bet you my colleagues will say something. My final thought, and then silence, is that fundamentally the power of states is a function of their internal cohesion more than anything else, more even than their firepower. And that's why I wrote The Great Degeneration, to make the point that the institutions that made the United States so dominant as a power in the second half of the 20th century are in much less good health than we recognize, whether we're talking about public finance, the rule of law, or civil society. The only consolation is the Chinese have even bigger problems there. And with that, I'll shut up. Thanks.
Thanks, Neil. Sean.
Well, it is really great to be here. This is the perfect day to be talking about books because it's raining out. We should all be home reading books. It's not the perfect day for me to be talking about the recording labels, however. I've written a book, I'm here to push a book, in fact, about Columbia Records. I wrote a book about the history of Columbia Records, the oldest recording company in the world. But to think about recording companies and power in the 21st century is absurd. The life expectancy of recording companies now falls somewhere below that of printed news magazines and pornography. I mean, it's just not, they're not going to be around very long. So I'm not going to talk about it. We can talk about soft power, we can talk about music, all the rest of it, but I don't think that Columbia Records fits in so well. So what am I going to talk about? I like to talk about power in the 21st century. And I was reminded that I do a certain amount of writing for other places, including that great political magazine, Rolling Stone magazine, which is related to Columbia Records. And there I've written a fair amount about American politics. And to think about power in the 21st century is, in fact, to talk, as Neil was saying, about America's institutions and where America's institutions are. And I wanted to try and throw out a few ideas about the political sources of America's difficulties these days. Now, we all know that you hear constantly talk about Washington being in a state of gridlock. And that's a source of great, great difficulty for the American people and for the American government. Some say that the system is at fault. You know, there's the eternal, every 20 years someone says we should rewrite the American Constitution, which I think is a very bad idea, but still people think the system is out of whack. Some say that the President of the United States, President Obama, ought to spend more time having people over, right? Just, bring people in, talk to them, give them a few drinks, maybe play a round of golf or two. I think that this misses the problem. There's nothing particularly cosmic about the difficulties that the American government is facing right now. There's nothing particularly about gridlock. There's nothing particularly grand, although there is something that is historical. And that is this, that basically the American government now is caught up with a political minority that is determined at all costs to maintain itself, to maintain its power. It's as simple as that, really. And if you wonder, if you want the empirical evidence of that, I suggest you look at a book by Norman Ornstein and Thomas Mann from the American Enterprise Institute and the Brookings Institution. Neither of them, we're not talking about the center of American progress here. They're very, very mainstream, centrist Washington observers, and they've made the point again and again that the minority in the Republican Party, which is now driving the Republican Party, is responsible for what we call gridlock. It's not both parties being unable to do something. It's not something that suddenly happened to the American, to the federal government. It is that. Having thrown that out, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we are looking towards in the 21st century with that fact, and if that fact continues. I think we're looking at very dangerous things, and I think we're looking at dangerous things that have nothing to do simply with Washington. I think that if we look only at Washington, we're missing the point. It's not simply about what's going on in the House Republican caucus. It's what's going on in the Republican Party throughout the country. And it's gone on with the Republican Party in the states. And it's indeed at the state level that I think the most alarming changes are occurring as far as the ability of these people to try and hold on to power by any means necessary. And so I'll turn to the states. I mean, there are many ways I could go about this, and we can talk about it later on. But one thing that concerns me the most, and I think has the most to do with all of us, is the current effort at the state level to change voting. The voter suppression movement that's going on right now. In the wake of the Supreme Court's decision, which gutted the main parts of the Voting Rights Act, 6 southern states immediately began adopting new laws restricting voting. North Carolina is maybe the most egregious of these, shall we say. There's a law that was passed by both houses of the legislature. Governor McCrory is yet to sign it, although he said he will sign it. What they've done in North Carolina is to eliminate the possibility of voting with a school ID, with a public employee ID. They've eliminated same-day registration of voting. They've cut down on early voting. It's been estimated that some 318,000 North Carolinians will be deprived of the vote when this law goes through. they will be disproportionately young, minority, mostly African American, and Democrats. That will have an extraordinary impact on the election, especially in a swing state like North Carolina. There's not been a single case of voter fraud reported in North Carolina in living memory. This is not a solution to a problem. This is an attempt to rig the system by a group of people who see the writing on the wall. Demographically, North Carolina is not going in the direction of this group. It's going in the other direction. So, change the system. That's what's going on. It's not just going on in the South even, it's going on in Pennsylvania, it's going on in several states where the writing is on the wall. And I could pull up some quotations of, especially in Pennsylvania, of Republican operatives admitting this.
Sean, that might be a good place to stop the intro.
Great.
And we'll get back to it. Because I think it's a
moment.
very important point, and it in some way meshes with the title of Moises' book, The End of Power. And a lot of what all these folks have looked at is how power shifts and it's how it's shifting. So Moises, why don't you give us an intro?
Thank you. I too am delighted to be here. And Niall and Sean have given us a very, very good summary of some of the main anxieties that are driving conversations and debates today. One of the anxieties, of course, is the ability of the United States to retain its leadership. And as Sean mentioned, that has a lot to do with the political gridlock, the shifts in power between demographic groups and voters and all that. What my book says is that those two are just concrete manifestations of a deeper set of trends that I think are the defining trends of our time. I argue that power is not merely shifting, and we know that, and I think Niall mentioned it. Power is shifting from west to east, from north to south, from presidential palaces to public squares, and we have seen it on television. And whenever you turn on your television or you read the newspapers, you see manifestations of that. In some places, you even see that power is shifting from men to women. Not as much as we would like, but that too is happening. But I say that there is something more going on, that power is not merely shifting, power is decaying. By decay, I mean that power has become easier to acquire, harder to use, and easier to lose. And furthermore, I say that this not only applies to nation states, but it applies to all human endeavors, from religions to universities, from the military to business, and from pick your choice, from sports to science. Pick any human endeavor and look at the institutions that drive that endeavor, and you will see that those that have power today have less power than in the past. And that includes the president of China and that of the United States, the CEO of Goldman Sachs and the head of the Ford Foundation, the World Bank, the IMF, and everyone else. And the numbers, as I was writing the book, I was aware that what I was saying was going against the grain of the conversation in the world today. That essentially says that power is becoming more concentrated. And so my only option was to let the numbers talk and do the talking. And so the book has a lot of evidence to support what I just said about the decay of power. And there are some very striking, very surprising numbers as to what is going on. The world has become a far more insecure, unsafe place for dictators and monopolists. Tyrants now, of course, they're still there, and by no means I argue that they are not very important centers of power. The CEO and the chairman of JP Morgan is a very powerful person, but less powerful than he was a few years ago, and less powerful than his predecessors. And the same applies to all the CEOs of all larger corporations, all the heads of states, as I said. And so why? Why is this happening? Well, the first instinct is to blame the internet or to celebrate the internet and social media and all of the forces and all the tools that allow us to connect, to organize, to mobilize, energize in all sorts of ways. And it would be foolish to deny that that's a very important factor, but I don't think that internet and social media are the main forces driving this. These are technologies and techniques and tools need users, and users need direction and motivation. So more than looking at the tools, let's look at the forces that drive the motivations and the direction in which these new players, these new empowered groups are now destabilizing the established powers. I call them the mega players that are being constrained by the micro powers. And then I look at what are the forces that drive this. And so there is a long list of factors. But in order to have power, you have to have a unique asset or sets of assets. And that create barriers that limit what the challengers can do to you. So the incumbents have something that prevents others of taking power away. And that power can be market share, or it can be the number of voters that you have, or it can be how large is your flock if you are a religion, a church. And so what's happening is that those unique assets that shield the powerful from the challenges of the challengers are going down, are coming down. And they're coming down for three reasons that I call the three revolutions. The first I call the more revolution. And that tries to capture the fact that we live in a world of profusion. There is more of everything. There's more countries and more people, more political parties and more criminals, and more computers and more medicines and more guns. And if you take any indicator of the human condition and look at what it was 10, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and measure it and look at it, what it is now, you will see an explosion. All of these indicators, from caloric intake to all kinds of, to the economy, to the size of the economy, to the number of medicines that we have, everything has skyrocketed in terms of numbers. So we live in a world of more. And the second revolution is the mobility revolution. And that is that this more that we have is not just more, but it moves more. And so everything moves more, ideologies and goods and services and money and people, everything. Last year, we broke the 1 billion people mark for tourism. Last year, 1 billion people, 1 billion humans visited another country, which is unprecedented in our history. And so everything moves more. And the third revolution is the mentality. When you put together the more revolution with the mobility revolution and you shake it, you end up having profound changes in mentality, changes in values, aspirations, expectations. And therefore, what is happening is that the more revolution is overwhelming the barriers that used to shield the powerful. The mobility revolution is helping the challengers circumvent the barriers. And the mentality revolution is undermining them. And together, they are creating a situation in which power is easier to get, harder to use, and much easier to keep. Thank you.
Thank you, Moises. So I've got a couple of questions, and I want you to start thinking about what questions you might have. I know Neil's chomping at the bit to respond some, but before I let him give just some comments that he has, you know, if you could just take 2 minutes and walk through, I thought it was very interesting to think about the evolution in power among countries and how that kind of beginning of time to now how we got there. I know it's a major conversation, but if you can just give everybody kind of an idea of your view of that evolution and how we got where we are and why countries sit where they are now.
In 2 minutes.
In 2 minutes, 2 minutes. I mean,
I don't think I'll need that long.
we can go on the beach. We're going on the beach later on if people want to. But
listening to
this is about power. So
listening to Moises, I was, of course, inclined to disagree just for the sake of entertaining you all, and also because I disagree. The most striking feature of modernity is the power of the nation state, which is in fact a relatively recent institutional form. As I've written in more than one book, most of history is characterized by the formation and dissolution of empires and a multitude of smaller polities which tend to be absorbed by empires. The emergence of the nation state, something with a distinctive form of legitimacy bound up with national identity, and a whole set of bureaucratic and other structures that allowed the state to wield power over its population on a far larger scale than any previous form of polity. That's really the big story of modernity. And what's amazing is how the nation state just keeps on keeping on. People come along periodically and say, corporations are going to take over the world. And they don't. In fact, nation states always have the whip hand when it comes to the crunch. As we were talking, I got a news alert from the Wall Street Journal 6 minutes ago, and it simply says, Obama vetoes Apple product ban. That's the power that I'm talking about. The ultimate power of the chief executive of the most powerful nation state to make decisions that bind corporations. So while I'm very sympathetic to Moises' argument that we have more mobility in particular, and that mentalities are changing, and I agree that that's bad news if you're a Middle Eastern tyrant, I don't think it's bad news if you're running one of the big modern nation states. Let me remind you of one of my earlier questions. Who ultimately is the more powerful president? Barack Obama or John F. Kennedy? If you think about the power that technology has given the President of the United States, power that would have been beyond the wildest dreams of Kennedy, it's very easy to give an answer to that question. And maybe, just maybe, Sean, we should be as conscious of the power that the President now wields, not only over our email accounts and every phone call we make, but over a great deal else besides. We should be as concerned about that as we should be concerned about Republican gerrymandering and other gambits at the state level.
Well, Sean, let me get you back to voting rights and that source of power and where you see this going. I mean, you were headed to a destination. Now where do you see the voting rights situation taking us?
Well, I mean, I don't know where it's going to go. It's not going anywhere. I mean, it goes to the point that Neil was raising earlier about cohesion within nation states and how important that is. And that's true not just in the United States, but throughout the West. But I don't see it going anywhere good in the sense of expanding democracy anywhere soon. But I do think that there has to be a different approach taken, and this goes back to President Obama. I think the important thing is to recognize what this threat is. That's the problem. We can talk about it, and we can see it, and it's sort of filtering out in the news, in the newspapers and social media, what have you. But the problem has not been identified. And it will not be identified with the approach taken previously, that you can somehow reason together, that you can somehow have a post-partisan world, that we are living in a post-partisan world. I think that that's an error that the president made that has made the situation much worse. Because this is not anything new. This has been brewing for a very long time. It's been brewing for at least 15, 20 years. It's gotten worse. You see much more of it now because you'll remember after the 2012 election that the Republican Party had a great deal of soul searching. Right? We have to change ourselves. We have to be less, bigoted on immigration. We have to do all of these changes. And what's happened is that they decided to double down. And they decided to double down because they see the writing on the wall. So I think a different approach. I mean, the ultimate part of this is nullification. A word that you hear. I mean, this is a word. Those of us who study John C. Calhoun are sort of happy to see this coming back because we can talk about it to you guys and explain to you exactly what nullification is about. But the fact is, it's not. The last time that we heard about nullification was in 1963, in which, at a time when, 50 years ago, when Martin Luther King was talking about how, from the Southern governors, dripping from their lips were the words, of interposition and nullification. We are hearing that again. It's not surprising. So as long as this political rift is there, I mean, I think we need a president much more like, say, Andrew Jackson, who told the nullifiers exactly where to get off, who identified the problem and took care of it, crushed it. I think that the problem that we're facing today is that we're in a state of drift about all of this. And then as long as the drift continues, the things that I was talking about are going to continue to get worse.
Moises, I saw you reacting as well.
Yeah, I of course disagree with you.
And we'll open it up to you after this comment.
Get out of the way because.
I don't hear any shrapnel.
The buffers here.
So very, very quickly at the end of the book, when I start thinking how to think about this, I urge my readers to be careful of professors that are in the elevator. The elevator thinking that I denounce in the book is the obsession about which countries go up and which countries come down. There is a cottage industry of academics, think tanks, thinkers, and writers that are just very worried about which countries are coming up and which countries are declining. And the way they do that is by measuring GDP and announcing that the IMF in a few years has announced that the GDP of China is going to be larger than the United States, and that is a reason to panic. Well, China ends up being a very poor country beset by all kinds of contradictions. And even if China gets to have a GDP larger than the United States, as it was said here, they still have huge deficits and huge lags that will make them very complicated. And that's my point about the diminution of power. Those presidents that run these countries, in fact, are hobble giants. That powerful president that we were just mentioned, that was able to stop an Apple product, is a president that cannot get a budget approved. Is a president that has to deal with things like the fiscal cliff and the sequester and all kinds of constraints. And those are just manifestations of a more profound trend, where we were talking about gridlock and everything else that was mentioned. One, if you look at the numbers, and the book shows that one of the endangered species in politics in the world today is a landslide. The mandate. If you look at how many governments won by a significant, when you had elections that are free and fair and democratic, and you look, what was the margin of victory of the candidate they won an election, you will discover that that margin has been shrinking to the point of disappearance. Of course, we still have occasional landslides, and occasional significant wins by significant margins, but mostly voters are telling the system that they go for divided governments. And that out of the 34 countries that belong to the Rich Nations Club of the OECD that are democracies, only 4 have a government that also controls parliament. The rest, 30 out of the 34, they have to get into these unwieldy, complicated, unstable coalitions that make decisions very hard to make, that they go to the minimum common denominator, that they're late, they're diluted, they're watered down, and that's what voters around the world are complaining, that democracies are not delivering at the speed and the quality of public policy decisions as the problems that we have deserve. Politics around the world are becoming Italian. Everywhere, what we are seeing is the emergence of democracies that have a very strong component of vitocracy. That is a term coined by Frank Fukuyama. A vitocracy is a system in which you have a proliferation of actors, institutions, even individuals that have just enough power to block the initiatives of others, but no one has enough power to push through an agenda. Show me...
Moises, see, this with professors too. They used to teach for 3 hours at a time and not getting these 5-minute sound bites in. Let's get a couple of questions in, because I know people may be chomping here, and you'll get a chance to react.
You want to go to the microphone? Right behind you.
So there's dead time. You could have taken it there. So.
Would the panelists please speak more about American demographics, immigration reform, and whether immigrants who have come to our country in the last 10 or 20 years still pursue the traditional American dream?
Neil, you want to take?
Well, I have a certain advantage in answering that question. As an immigrant and a green card holder, married to someone who just became a citizen this year. Our son, who's 19 months old, was born in Boston, is an American citizen. I think we certainly subscribe to the American dream of individual freedom above all else. Indeed, I think my wife is a living emblem of that dream, as somebody who came from a completely unfree background, as a girl born into a Somali Muslim clan. So my response to this question is that of an immigrant. You'll never hear me argue against immigration. You can have a discussion about the problem of integration and assimilation. In other words, what happens to immigrants once they come to a country, but that problem is a far more acute one in Europe than it is in the United States, where, to my eyes, the remarkable thing is the speed with which immigrants become American and the extent to which their children feel themselves to be American. There are exceptions to that rule, and we should look very closely at those exceptions. The Tsarnaev brothers, who wreaked havoc in my city, Boston, this year, are very telling illustrations of what can go wrong if that process of integration and assimilation fails, and perhaps also of how much harder that process becomes where immigrants are Muslims. I'll say one last thing on this subject. When I listen to the debates on immigration between American politicians, I have a constant sense that these debates are about the wrong thing. They're debates about the wrong issues. The biggest problem in American immigration policy today is that we are doing too little to ensure that the skilled, the talented, the motivated come here and stay here. We have a policy which is fixated on the Mexican border at a time when that issue may become less and less important as the Mexican economy shows every sign of growing faster than the US economy right now. Anybody see that great South Park episode where Cartman becomes a border guard at just the moment that the Mexicans want to leave? You should watch that. It'll cure you of any angst you may have about that fence. So that's my sort of 10 cents on this. I think we could have a serious immigration debate, and I think the United States could learn a lot from what other countries are getting right, like Canada, for example. Because not attracting the smart people seems like the most obviously dumb thing that the United States could do right now.
Let us get another question in before they shut me down here. Sir with the lovely hat on there.
Thank you. There's another dimension of power that hasn't really been talked about, and let's just say call it the power of Wall Street. And I want to ask any of you to speak to this because in part it's a critique potentially of this argument that it's just the right wing of the Republican Party that we need to worry about. Do Wall Street have influence and power absent the right wing of the Republican Party in ways that we need to worry about? And well, I guess that's the essence of it.
Well, Wall Street's Wall Street. I mean, Wall Street's always going to be there, or I think it'll be there for a very long time, don't you?
Sure. And
So-
it will have power over both
But I don't think it's. I don't think. So I don't think that Wall Street has a monolithic political agenda. If that's what you're getting at, I mean, yeah.
I mean, the idea that, for example, when Mr. Naim talked about more, well, we also have more inequality. There may be less power, but mysteriously, fewer and fewer people have more and more wealth. So is that not linked to the political economy in a way that we need to think about? And is Wall Street not part of that, influencing policy through both parties? And so the power structure isn't just a dualistic political party, it's a vertical hierarchy that.
Well, the idea that I had, that Wall Street is somehow controlling this duopoly that is the Democrats and Republicans, I think misses how power is actually operating in this country. I truly do. I mean, yes, Wall Street is there. Wall Street has divided interests. Goldman Sachs is not the same as everything else. I mean, Wall Street's Wall Street. But the difference is that you have the policies that really matter to people, that affect our lives, everybody's life, comes out of the presidency in part, and out of Congress, and out of the state legislatures. In terms of, you name it, in terms of the possibilities for social mobility, the possibilities for achieving that individual freedom that we all seek, those are things that are not determined by Wall Street, they're determined by the American government, one way or another. And that's why when I say that this is the group that has to be worried about, it's because this is the group that is making that impossible.
Moises, if you don't want to say anything, I actually agree with you. And when Moises was talking, one of the things I wrote down was, what about growing inequality, the 1%? I also wrote down concentration of financial power. The Great Degeneration is a book that tries to talk about what's going wrong institutionally in this country. And one of the things it talks about is precisely this point, that the political institutions, particularly the ones in Washington, are more than they have been, certainly in our lifetime, subject to very powerful lobbying. And if you want to see what that lobbying achieves, look at Dodd-Frank, the financial regulation bill. So my sense is that Moises' story of the end of power is must be a source of great amusement to Jamie Dimon. I'm sure he reads the book and slaps his thigh with amusement that anybody could think the power of Wall Street has diminished. It has greatly increased because one consequence of the financial crisis, in case you didn't notice, has been to increase the concentration by reducing the number of players at the top of the financial system and giving them what amounts to a guaranteed rather than just an implicit bailout if they are really large, systemically important institutions. So I'm with you. I mean, I don't normally wear hats like that, and you might expect me, I actually do have a hat like that. So you might expect me as the kind of only conservative in Martha's Vineyard to disagree with the obvious hippie in the audience, but actually, sir, I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you.
All right, we're going to let Moises react, and then you got to shut it down, but they will be available for signings and to speak some more. Moises.
There's no denying that Wall Street has a lobbying capacity that biases public policy in their favor. There's no denying that inequality has become more acute now than in the last 30 years. The connection between the two exists, but are not as straightforward as you mentioned or is supported. The notion that Wall Street now has more power, I don't have the time, but in the book there is a list of these titans of Wall Street and what has happened to them since the financial crisis. One of them, one that came on top, Bob Diamond at Barclays, lost his job. HSBC has all sorts of problems for all kinds of reasons. All of the large banks are now have all kinds of circumstances constraining their power. And inequality has become such a powerful lightning rod for good reasons, and I welcome that, one of the trends that you're going to see in the next few years is a very, very strong backlash against the forces, institutions, and policies that have created the inequality that we now have in the country.
Okay. Do you want to end?
Yeah, I want to thank our panelists.